I think my wife's friend has feelings for me. She's sitting on my lap at parties, sending me pictures of rings, and my wife just laughs it off. Am I crazy? Or in the middle of a disaster waiting to happen? I know exactly how this is probably going to come across. Arrogant, self-absorbed, maybe even a bit self-congratulatory. It's the kind of thing that, when you first hear it, makes you want to roll your eyes and dismiss the person saying it as full of themselves. And honestly, I wouldn't even blame you for thinking that. But before you jump to conclusions or pass judgment, I really need you to hear me out, because this situation isn't nearly as simple or as flattering as it might initially sound. My wife and I share a long history together, going back roughly 2 decades. We started out as friends, slowly transitioned into dating, and eventually spent 9 years building a strong foundation before we finally tied the knot. We've now been married for 5 years, and in all that time, she has proven to be everything I could ever hope for in a partner, steady in times of chaos, loving even when life gets messy, and a devoted mother to our children. Alongside our relationship, one constant in her life has been her best friend, Dolly. The two of them met back in their late teens and have been inseparable ever since. Their connection runs much deeper than casual friendship. It mirrors the bond of sisters who have weathered every high and low side by side, sharing secrets, heartbreaks, and milestones in a way only lifelong friends can. The problem is Dolly's track record with men reads like a catalog of worst-case scenarios. For years, she has cycled through relationships with partners who gaslight her, belittled her ambitions, and weaponized her trust until it was threadbare. More than once she has shown up at our doorstep after midnight, mascara streaked, clutching a half-packed duffel because another boyfriend had erupted in rage or vanished without explanation. Every few weeks, she spills the whole saga in our kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug she never actually drinks from, recounting the lies, the shouting matches, the slow erosion of her self-confidence. The latest boyfriend was the worst yet, jealous, manipulative, forever checking her phone and policing her outfits. Their final blow-up ended with him hurling her keys into the street and calling her worthless. After that, she told my wife she was finished with dating altogether. She wanted a clean break, time to stitch herself back together, space to remember who she was before all the drama. But almost immediately after making that vow, I noticed a subtle, then not so subtle, shift in how she acted around me. It started innocently enough. Dolly began slipping little remarks into her conversations with my wife. Things like, "You don't know how lucky you are to have him," or "It must feel amazing to have someone who actually listens and takes care of you." At first, it felt harmless, the kind of casual admiration friends express when they're comparing relationships or highlighting the positives in each other's lives. My wife would usually just smile or laugh it off, and I brushed it aside as her trying to cope with her own dating history. But over time, the comments grew heavier, more pointed. The admiration stopped sounding like friendly observations and started to carry a note of longing, as if she wasn't just complimenting our marriage, but wishing aloud for a piece of it. That shift didn't stop with words either. Dolly slowly began channeling that same energy directly toward me, lingering a little longer in conversations, seeking my reactions, giving me a different kind of attention than she had in the past. At one point, during a lighthearted evening at home, my wife made an offhand joke that Dolly was basically like my second wife, the one who picked up slack on little things my wife didn't feel like doing. It was tossed out in laughter, the kind of silly, throwaway line you make among friends who know each other well. We all chuckled, and for the moment, it felt like nothing more than playful banter. But where my wife and I let the joke fade, Dolly clung to it. What was supposed to be a one-time quip slowly transformed into a recurring nickname. She leaned into it with surprising enthusiasm, eagerly calling herself the second wife whenever she was around, as though the label gave her a role or position in my life that carried some unspoken legitimacy. At first, it was awkward but still brushed off as humor, until she raised the stakes. One day, out of the blue, Dolly sent me a picture of a ring she liked, accompanied by the message, "Even your second wife deserves a ring." The words were framed with a smile, but the undertone was unmistakable. That single message shifted the whole dynamic from quirky inside joke to something unsettlingly suggestive, blurring a line I hadn't expected would ever be tested. Whenever Dolly came over, a new, almost tactile neediness clung to her. The most jarring examples happened at two separate house parties we hosted. Both times the living room couches were full, and I instinctively stood to offer Dolly my seat. Instead of taking it, she brushed my hand aside with a playful, "Don't be silly," then settled straight onto my lap, draping an arm around my shoulders as if it were the most natural thing in the world. My wife, catching the scene from across the room, simply laughed and shook her head, treating it like harmless comedy while I sat frozen beneath Dolly's unexpectedly intimate weight. That new boldness spilled into her words as well. She'd lean in during conversation, lower her voice, and murmur, "You always make me feel so safe," or look up through her lashes to ask, "Are you happy to see me?" A question loaded with subtext. Between sentences, she'd smooth her dress over her hips or adjust a strap so it drew my eyes exactly where she wanted them, then wait expectantly for a reaction. "How does this outfit look on me?" became a refrain, each time delivered with a subtle twist of her body to spotlight her curves, as though my approval were the only mirror that mattered. Determined to keep every card face up, I sat my wife down after the second lap-sitting incident and walked her through the whole timeline. Dolly's lingering touches, the second wife, nickname, the photo of the ring, even the way she fishes for compliments. I expected at least a raised eyebrow. Instead, my wife let out a soft laugh and waved her hand as if swatting away a gnat. "Oh, come on. That's just Dolly," she said. "She's harmless. She doesn't mean anything by it." Her tone was light, reassuring, the same tone she uses when our toddler insists there are monsters under the bed. I tried a second time, explaining that Dolly's behavior didn't feel harmless from where I was sitting, but my wife merely repeated the refrain. Dolly wouldn't cross a real boundary. I was reading too much into it. The conversation ended with her patting my arm and changing the subject to what we should make for dinner. I walked away unsettled. I kept replaying Dolly's relationship history in my head. Years of chaos, jealousy, and emotional neglect. She has never had a partner who offered consistent kindness or stability. What if the basic decency I show her, a chair offered, a conversation listened to, has morphed into a blueprint for the partner she's convinced herself she needs? What if I've become a living fantasy she's determined to inhabit? And, more worrying, what happens on the day that fantasy crosses a line my wife can't shrug off with a laugh? After a couple of sleepless nights replaying every awkward laugh and lingering touch in my head, I realized a quick mention over dinner wasn't going to cut it. I needed a real sit-down. Phones silenced, kids distracted, no easy exits. So one evening, after the house had finally gone quiet, I asked my wife to join me at the kitchen table. I'd rehearsed my points all day. The steady progression from innocent compliments to physical closeness, the second wife, label mutating into ring photos, the way it had begun to twist my stomach with dread. I laid it all out like evidence in a courtroom, careful to keep my voice calm, but honest about how shaken I was. She listened without interrupting, arms folded, her expression unreadable. When I finished, I waited for the usual dismissive wave, except it never came. Instead, she drew a deep breath and, with a guilty half-smile, confessed the reality I'd never considered. Not only had she seen every step of Dolly's behavior, she had quietly encouraged it. As it turned out, this entire situation hadn't grown in a vacuum. At some point, during one of Dolly's darker spirals after her last breakup, she broke down to my wife and confessed something raw and painful. "I wish I had a man like yours. I'll never know what it feels like to be genuinely loved, supported, and appreciated." It wasn't the first time Dolly had shared something along those lines, but this time her words carried a depth of longing that struck my wife hard. Wanting to comfort her best friend, and, in hindsight, trying to play the fixer, my wife made what she thought was a harmless, even compassionate, suggestion. She told Dolly that if she truly wanted to understand what a healthy relationship dynamic looked like, she could treat me more like a boyfriend. She didn't mean this in the physical sense. There was never supposed to be touching, flirting, or anything resembling intimacy. The idea was emotional only. Dolly could use me as a model, observe how I treated my wife, and even lean on me lightly for support, so she could internalize what respect, consistency, and genuine affection should feel like. My wife genuinely thought she was doing something kind, a small act to lend her best friend perspective. But of course, what looks harmless in theory rarely stays that way in practice. Once Dolly started receiving that steady stream of attention and kindness from me, checking in on her, listening without judgment, treating her words as if they mattered, she didn't want it to end. She admitted later that she found a level of comfort and validation in it that she had never experienced in any of her relationships, and with that came a reluctance to let go. That's when behaviors began to slide into uncomfortable territory. The clinginess, the way she'd press her head to my shoulder, the deliberate choice to sit on my lap instead of a chair, the exaggerated jokes about being my second wife. My wife admitted she had been naive. She thought this little experiment would stop at light-hearted role-playing, that it would stay well within the boundaries of friendship. But the instant Dolly sent me that picture of the ring with the line, "Even your second wife deserves a ring," she realized she had unintentionally created a problem that was spiraling out of her control. So, the next step became obvious. We couldn't pretend this was just harmless anymore. It had gone too far. The plan was clear. The three of us needed to sit down, put everything on the table, and re-establish boundaries before the whole thing threatened not just Dolly's friendship, but the stability of our marriage. At last, the day came when there was no more putting it off. We arranged for the kids to spend the evening at their aunt's house, so there would be no interruptions, no little ears overhearing things they could never unhear. The house felt strangely quiet without them, heavy even, like it knew a difficult truth was about to be dragged out into the light. When Dolly arrived, she seemed almost cheerful, as if this was just another casual evening together. My wife offered her tea, trying to keep things normal, but the tension was already thick enough to taste. We all gathered around the dining table. No television humming in the background, no phones to break the silence. Just the three of us, the air charged with an unspoken weight. I was the first to speak. I leaned forward, bracing my hands against the edge of the table, and made it clear from the very beginning. Tonight, we're not dodging anything. Everything needs to be said openly. No half-truths, no sugarcoating, no games. Whatever's been hanging in the air between us, it's time we face it for what it really is. Both of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and for the first time, I saw the flicker of nerves cross Dolly's face. My wife glanced at me, guilty but silent, waiting for the storm we all knew was coming. Slowly, the truth began to spill out, piece by piece, like a knot unraveling. First, Dolly lowered her eyes, her voice trembling as she admitted what none of us had wanted to say aloud. She was envious, painfully, deeply envious, of my wife's marriage. She confessed that for as long as she could remember, she had only known relationships built on instability, manipulation, or outright cruelty. Watching us together, seeing the small, everyday ways I cared for my wife and the quiet strength of our bond, left her with a hollow ache. "I've gone my whole life without knowing what it feels like to be genuinely wanted and cherished," she murmured, and for the first time I saw just how raw that sense of loss was for her. Then my wife spoke, her words heavy with regret. She admitted she had tried to ease Dolly's pain with what she thought was a helpful solution. Wanting her best friend to understand what a healthy relationship could look like, she suggested Dolly borrow me emotionally, not as a lover, but as an example. The idea, in her mind, was simple. Dolly could observe, interact, and lean on me in small ways to learn what respect, consistency, and affection should feel like, so she wouldn't settle for toxic partners again. My wife's voice cracked as she admitted just how badly she had miscalculated. Dolly nodded through tears, confirming that what began as a source of harmless consolation quickly became something else. She confessed she didn't want it to stop, that the little glimpses of support and steadiness had turned into something she started to crave. That hunger, she admitted, explained everything. The way she clung to me in conversation, the way she sought my validation, even the way she had leaned into this second wife joke until it turned into asking me for a ring. Moments that had once seemed quirky or playful were really her attempts to stretch boundaries further, to keep grasping at a kind of closeness she couldn't let go of. I listened without interrupting, but when both of them had finished, I made sure my response was measured, resolute. I explained, calmly, but with no room for misinterpretation, that this was a dangerous game we'd been playing. What they thought was a small kindness had already begun to chip away at the trust at the center of our marriage, and if it went on unchecked, it could have destroyed more than just a friendship. It could have broken a family. I told them plainly that it wasn't fair. Not to me, who had been left in the dark. Not to my wife, who now carried guilt for her own missteps. Not to Dolly, who had been set up with false hope instead of real support. And least of all, not to our marriage, which had been dragged into a situation it never should have been part of. Finally, I said what had been sitting heavy on my chest from the start. If I had been included, if we had acted together as a united front, then maybe we could have helped Dolly in a healthier, safer way, without crossing lines, without risking what mattered most. When the weight of my words settled between us, there was a long silence. Both of them sat with their guilt plainly written across their faces, and for a moment I wondered if either of them would actually say the words out loud. Then Dolly spoke first. Her eyes were glossy, her hands fidgeting on the edge of the table, and her voice broke as she admitted what had been hiding behind all the jokes and theatrics. She confessed that she had allowed her own loneliness and desperation to cloud her judgment, that she had mistaken the comfort and safety I offered as something she could claim, even though it was never meant for her. I knew it was wrong, but it felt so good to finally feel cared for that I didn't want to stop, she whispered, tears catching in her lashes. In that moment, the bravado she often masked herself with was gone, replaced with someone fragile and painfully human. Then my wife spoke, her tone thick with remorse. She said her intentions had never been malicious, but she could see now how misguided they had been. What she had called empathy had, in truth, been recklessness disguised as kindness. Giving Dolly permission to blur boundaries, without first involving me, had opened a door that should never have been cracked. She admitted she had underestimated how much her friend's longing could grow and how dangerous it was to normalize intimacy that didn't belong to her. I thought I was helping her, but I was careless, she said, her voice low and full of shame. To their credit, neither of them deflected, minimized, or tried to spin excuses. They owned it completely. Both women sat across from me, openly acknowledging they had mishandled everything. And for the first time since this entire mess began, I felt a glimmer of relief. At least now, finally, the truth was on the table. So where does that leave us now? Dolly is still a part of our lives, and my wife is not willing to abandon a friendship that has spanned nearly 2 decades. But the way we interact with her is going to look very different from here on out. Boundaries, which before were blurry at best, are now being redrawn with firm, deliberate lines. No more over-familiar touching, no more playful second wife jokes, no more late-night attention-seeking masquerading as banter. She'll still have our support, but it will be rooted in respect, distance, and clarity. Support given as friends who care, not as substitutes for a partner she doesn't yet have. As for my wife, she is carrying the heaviest weight of guilt. She admitted that what she thought was a clever way to help her best friend was, in truth, a mistake born of misplaced empathy. She regrets opening this door, regrets not telling me sooner, and regrets ever thinking she could control how far the situation might spiral. She swore to me, with absolute conviction, that she will never again gamble with our marriage in the name of being helpful. She's been humbled by this, and though it hurt to get here, I believe she's learned something she won't forget. And me? Honestly, I'm running on fumes. I feel like I've been carrying the tension of 2 households on my back, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Yes, I'm relieved that everything has finally been dragged into the open, that apologies were given, and that we've managed to salvage both the friendship and the marriage. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't drained. After the storm of confessions and uncomfortable truths, the only thing I really wanted in that moment was to sit back, exhale, and crack open a strong, ice-cold beer. At the end of the day, this whole mess has been an exhausting lesson in boundaries, communication, and how even good intentions can backfire in spectacular ways. My wife and I are moving forward stronger. Dolly is getting the support she needs without blurring lines, and I can finally breathe knowing it's no longer a hidden tension simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't the neat fairy tale resolution some people might hope for, but it's real, and it's ours. And for those wondering, no, there will absolutely not be a threesome. Some doors, once closed, are never meant to be reopened.